I'm originally from Ohio, so I grew up outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, in a small little suburb called Delhi. It's on the west side of town. We had about 20 acres, so lots of woods. No, really, it wasn't a farm. My father was not a farmer. In fact, he was a white-collar worker, but you know, we grew up out in the country, and that was just, it was, I think that had a real good foundation for me, having that free spirit, being outside a lot. All of those things are part of who I am still. I love still being outside. Like many young girls, I guess, always loving animals. I mean, much to my mother's dismay, brought home all kinds of stray animals, both wild and domestic. So I've always had that interest of being around animals, working with animals. Worked very hard when I was a kid to be able to take riding lessons because, again, being from such a large family, it wasn't something that my parents could afford. So it became a thing, if you want to do it, you know, then you have to earn the money to do it. And I think that was one thing that actually, you know, taught me at a very young age that if you believe in something and you really want to do something, it's possible to make it happen. And so I did. I started riding horses when I was very young. I rode my bike to the stable. I'd ride my bike home from the stable so that my parents didn't have to do anything with it because it was essentially my project. I wanted to do that. And then the other thing that I did actually was when I was in high school, I was a junior zooster. And so I used to work at the zoo and do tours, sort of like a junior docent, and did tours and talked about the animals that were there, learned a lot about a variety of wild animals. So I always had that interest in working with animals. And I think, again, like many young women, you thought, oh, I'm going to be a veterinarian. And I thought that's what I would do also. But it ended up that that wasn't where my career took me. And instead, I started in research, and I found it incredibly challenging and fulfilling because every day you learned something new. There wasn't a day that you didn't get a chance to learn something new if you were really open to that. And so I had a great experience that way. Of course, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school. And in Cincinnati, that's not so unusual. I mean, in that era, most of the schools were segregated Catholic schools. There were very few public high schools, actually, especially on the west side of town. And our brother's school was right next to us, which was also unusual. Most of the brother-sister schools were separated by miles. And so we were allowed, if you were in the top percent of your class, you were allowed to take classes at your brother's school. So I would take physics and some of the other sciences over there because that wasn't necessarily something that they taught the girls. And so I can remember taking classes there, and then I can remember also thinking that it would be really nice if you were college prep that you could take like typing classes. I mean, now of course everybody uses word processors, but at the time it was typewriters. And the administration was like, well, no, the girls that are in the business track take typing and they take shorthand. And it's like, but typing would be really helpful for those of us that are going to college. And so a couple of friends of mine, we started this campaign, and they actually then started a college prep typing class. And it was only for a quarter. You couldn't take it for a whole year, but you could take it for a quarter. So maybe that was something, again, that, you know, when I saw a need for something, it was like we would push to try and get it. This is back in the 70s. If you were thinking about going to vet school, if you lived in a state that had a vet school in it, that was your only option. You weren't allowed to go to another state's vet school because it just wasn't allowed at that time. And so because I was a resident of the state of Ohio and there was a vet school at Ohio State was my only option for college. Although I think about it now, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't have a lot of options. I think about my sons, you know, in the last couple of years when they've been trying to decide on colleges, and it's really open-ended. I mean, they can do all these web searches of places that they're thinking about going, and that wasn't even something that was available back then. So, because that's what I thought I wanted to do, I chose Ohio State, and I actually went into animal science and nutrition, again, because of being sort of that country girl. That seemed like a good tract for me. I finished in animal science and nutrition with a bachelor's, and then I had a minor in biology because I really enjoyed the biology. Some of my favorite courses when I was in school, I took a mammalogy course, and that worked very closely with the Columbus Zoo to learn the different mammals. So again, as I said earlier, I had that interest in the large cats, and at the time, there's a lot of interest in trying to expand the genetic quality of cheetahs, because it appears that they've been isolated so much and they have a lot of problems, and the population of cheetahs has gone down significantly. And how do you determine genetic variability without essentially taking some kind of a blood sample or something like that, which is rather invasive, because of course they're not going to just let you do that. So you have to, anesthetize them, and that's risky for the animal. And so one of my projects that I did very early on in college was to try and see if there was some way that I could look at coat pattern and determine what the genetic variability of the animals was. Now, it didn't work. My hypothesis did not work, but again, it's one of those things that sort of got me started down that road of, you can come up with interesting questions and then come up with a hypothesis and see if you can answer that question. And so maybe that's where my initial start in research came from. I'm not sure, but I did enjoy doing that project. I mean, I didn't get to have any hands-on experience, of course, with the cheetahs, but I was able to take pictures and spend a lot of time watching them, and I could recognize them from coat patterns and things like that. But it was, just interesting. To be quite honest, I was in a part of the institution that really was male dominated. I mean, I was in the College of Agriculture, which was primarily, farmers' sons, economists, agricultural economists, things like that. So I was sort of like the odd duckling out. And I think the other thing actually is that because I was working to help put myself through school. I mean, my parents helped as much as they could, but, I had work-study jobs and other jobs like that. I didn't have a lot of extra time. I was lucky enough while I was at Ohio State to get a chance to work and work-study at the vet school there. And so, again, I got to stay involved with animals, and the pharmacist at the hospital, he was always very encouraging as far as, studying and helping me learn things if I was having difficulty with it. So he was always, his name was Justin Boyer, and he was a very strong influence, I guess, on me, trying to, keep me at the studies. He would make sure that I'd have work-study hours that sort of crossed from while the hospital was open to while it was after hours, so that while it was after hours, he knew I wasn't going to be that busy in the pharmacy, and I'd be able to actually study also. So he was, very supportive of that. Well, I had thought that maybe I would work in equine nutrition specifically, because I still had, my horse, and enjoyed showing horses. So I thought maybe I would get into equine nutrition, and it was very difficult to find a position doing that. And so I had an aunt actually who lived in California, and I went out to visit her. And while I was out there, there was a job opening listed for a research person at University of Southern California. And so I ended up applying for that position because it just sounded like an interesting job. And I actually got the job. I found out afterwards it was because the salary was so low that you couldn't possibly live in California on that salary. But because I was living with my aunt, I was able to make it work. And so that's how I actually then got started in research. So it was really sort of by accident that I got into research, but I loved it and did quite a bit with, it was at the time it was in biomedical engineering at University of Southern California. And the chair of the department, Fred Grodens, was really big into respiratory physiology. And so a lot of the stuff that we worked on was cardiovascular or respiratory in nature. We had several different animal models that we used, and there I actually had an excellent mentor in Fred Pearson, who taught me a lot about doing surgery with animals, how to care for the animals, what the models entailed, and he was always so dedicated to his job. And again, I think that was something that fit in well with what I already knew about myself, which was once I wanted to do something or once I got involved in something, I stuck with it. So that's how I got started in research. I was at USC then for 3 years, and then of course life continued in Ohio with my family, and being from a large family, brothers and sisters getting married all the time, and I would only get to come home for like the weekend, and so I finally got an opportunity to get into research, a research position back at Ohio State. And so back in 1982 I moved back to Ohio, to Central Ohio, to Ohio State, and stayed in research there until actually when my sons when the oldest was 4, I then switched from actively doing research to research administration. I knew that if I was going to get data that meant something, I had to take the best care of that animal as I could, regardless of what it was. You know, it didn't matter if it was a mouse or a rat. In my early years, I did a lot of work with chickens and ducks. But I knew that I had to take care of them. Plus, I'd always, and I think this was part of when I, was in high school and I used to work for a veterinarian, I always thought it was important, and still do, that if you have to euthanize an animal, that the last thing it hears is that you're a good boy, you were a good dog, you were, and I continued that through my research. I mean, I never thought about euthanizing any of my research, any of the animals that I worked with in research, without thanking them and telling them that that I got good data from them. I thought that was important. I know that maybe they didn't know what it meant, but they knew that they were cared for. I can honestly say that animals that I've worked with in research always knew that I cared about them, that they weren't just a tool. They were an important part of the research that was being conducted. So at the time, would I have said that was research ethics? Probably not. Now, of course, after being in it longer, getting involved with Primer, certainly it's research ethics. Now you couldn't do it, but back then, I mean, I would take the animals home for the weekend if it was a long weekend. They came home with me because I didn't feel right leaving them at the university. But even that has come a long way, because now you do have the exercise that's, a requirement for your larger animals, and, that the enrichment that's out there, all the different enrichments that are available for animals. So it is important to have that for the animals. I think sometimes we have maybe gotten a little bit too strict about, not allowing them to go with their their researchers, especially some of the larger animals. But I understand that too. So no, I've never felt conflicted about doing it, and I think it's because I knew that they were taken good care of. I was, again, research is variable hours. When you start a research project, you start it and you finish it when it's done, and those hours are a little bit variable. And it just didn't seem to me that I was getting to see my sons very much. And so I started to think about, what can I do that allows me more family time, but keeps me involved in the research part of it. And a position came available at Ohio State for someone to work in the IACUC office. And this would have been, like I said, in the late 90s. And I thought, what an interesting position. Let's look into that. And so I went and I applied and I actually got the position. And it has been a very good transition for me because I've had the chance to stay involved in research, keep up on different research projects that are out there. And in fact, in some ways, it's a little bit better as far as learning than the actual research was, because instead of being involved in one project, I get to be involved a little bit in a lot of projects because I'm reading a lot of different research techniques, research projects that are being proposed. So it ended up being a really good field for me to go into. It was a little bit harder to just sit at a desk than actually be working all the time. So that was a little bit hard to do initially. I know that the manager at the time, he always gave above a certain level these, I think they were called Berkman assessments. And it's this test that you take, and it's like 100 questions, and you're supposed to answer them just very quickly without thinking. And there are questions like, if I had my choice right now, I would be sitting at a bank being a teller, be a lawyer in a courtroom, be outside walking through the woods, and all of my answers were things like be outside, be with an animal, whatever. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're going to get these results back and they're going to say, what is she doing here? And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I walked into his office when he got the results back, and he looked at me and he said, Deb, you really think this is a good job for you? And I had to explain my rationale, and I said, I think it'll be okay, I really do. And it ended up being a very good job for me. I really have enjoyed being in the administrative side of it. And I think it's given me a good insight into what our counterparts on the research side are having to deal with, because I had to deal with that. So I can understand some of their concerns, some of their questions, some of their frustrations. Oh, I think probably the largest challenge is having sufficient additional personnel to make sure that you can try and get everything done that you want to get done. There's always these pie in the sky kinds of tasks that you would like to do better or improve. Well, some of the education, for at the local levels, to get involved with the community, when you've had a chance to learn more about research and what it's all about, and know that unfortunately the scientists and people in my position as research administrators, we don't get out there as much as we probably should to tell people about all the good things that are going on and about how much we do care, and all of the, and I don't want to call it regulations, although there are regulations for how we have to take care of the animals. For the most part, that's not what drives the care of the animals. It's not because there's a regulation that says you have to give the animal enrichment. That's not why our animals get enrichment. Our animals get enrichments because we care about them. And just like you have your dog at home that you take for a walk or that you hug and love, people that take care of research animals, they really care about them, and they're not doing it because it's a regulation. So I think that's probably one of the things that I think has always been a little bit slighted on the animal side of research. Certainly the human subject side of research, they have similar types of regulations, similar types of administration. They seem to get better funding, and so it's unfortunate.
If someone asked you what you do, how would you respond to a layperson?
I tell them that I'm involved in research administration, that I make sure that all the requirements, if you're going to do work with animals in your research, are being followed, that I make sure that that the scientists understand their responsibility and the privilege that comes with working with research animals. So I'm very upfront about that. I mean, I would go to, in fact, and I have gone to my son's schools many times when they've asked for parents to come in and talk about what they do and talk about work with animals in research, because I think it's important to get out there to the young kids. Um, they're so impressionable, and you have other institutions, other organizations that only paint a bad side. And that's not to say that there aren't things that do happen that shouldn't, but that's true in life. I mean, that's why we have, children that are abused and pets that are abused, because there are bad things that happen out there. But I would like to say that, for the most part, that doesn't happen in research. And I've been really lucky, our IACUCs, our institutional animal care and use committees, again, are required by regulation to have non-scientists and non-affiliated individuals on the committees. To me, those are the two most important people on that committee, because if the person that isn't a scientist and the person that has nothing to gain by saying no understand what the project is that's being done and understand the care that's being taken with those animals, and they're okay with it, that says a lot to me. And certainly, I know from my own experience that the non-affiliated members that I've been associated with, that was the first thing that they said they found most surprising about research with animals is the care. That they would walk into the facilities and they were so well taken care of, and the facilities were clean and orderly. So again, I think that's probably one of the things that I think also is a huge benefit of Primer, that they take that message out there. If you had more funding, you'd have more people. I know that there are a lot of institutional animal care and use committees out there on campuses and at institutions, CROs, pharmaceutical agencies, things like that, that are small. And so you've got one person that's trying to do a lot of things, and education isn't a requirement, certainly. That isn't a regulation. And so that tends to be one of the things that gets left off at the end of the day, is trying to do that outreach. And I think that's a really important part. But I do think that it's changing. And I think it's changing because of the growth in what is called post-approval monitoring. I don't particularly like that terminology, because to me it sounds like someone's watching over to make sure you're doing it well. I tend to think of it more as a facilitation, where you're working with the investigators to make sure that they've thought about everything, that they've got it all written down, that it is in their protocols and it is approved. So I tend to think that because there's this greater emphasis now on that portion of IACUC programs, that we are, by virtue of that, seeing more education and more outreach. Because if you do that in a way that is collegial and is collaborative, there is education. Because when you talk to the investigators, you're learning something and they're learning something about why we're watching these things. And I don't think most investigators feel it's too burdensome. I really don't. I know that that's sometimes the public perception, is that the investigators say, oh, this is too much, why are you making me do this? But I don't know that I've ever seen that to be true. Most of the investigators I've worked with absolutely understand what we're doing and think it's important. One of the things that I always do, especially if it's something that I don't have a lot of personal knowledge in, is I will try and look at their protocol and get an idea of what their overall goal is. And then I'll go in and I'll say, so how's the work going, getting an answer to, whether or not this particular cancer cell is going to metastasize. And that starts them talking. And as soon as they start talking, if you listen to someone and really listen, it's easy to come up with follow-up questions. I think that's an important thing. I think too many times we don't listen. Or as soon as we hear the answer that we want, we stop listening. And there's so much more information that comes after that sometimes. I've known Primer and Arena for a long time. I probably didn't really get started doing presentations, however, until I got into administration. So probably I didn't start actively participating in the conferences as far as faculty until the late 90s, early 2000s. But ever since then, I haven't missed many conferences. I try and always, have at least one or two breakout sessions that I volunteer to, work with. It's an excellent organization. I've learned a lot, met a lot of people. The premise behind the organization is one that I think is very important to, get the word out there to people. Plus, I know, it opens up a dialogue, which it's been considered a kind of a safe place to have dialogue with some of the, I don't want to say animal rights groups, because I think that paints people that care about animals and don't know about research in a bad light. Just because you care about animals and you want to learn more about it and you're concerned that things may be going on that are bad doesn't make you an animal rights activist. It makes you somebody who cares. I think Primer is an excellent place for those individuals to learn more about it, and a very safe place for them and a safe place for the investigators for the most part. Primer was very involved in starting the CPIA, the Certified Professional IACUC Administration. It was something that came out of several breakout sessions at the Primer conferences about whether or not we needed an organization like that that actually highlighted the professionalism that was required for someone to be an IACUC administrator. And so there was a core group of individuals that discussed that and worked with Primer to set up the CPIA. And when it started then, I thought it was a wonderful way to recognize how important it is to be an IACUC administrator. And so I did sit for the exam. I was in the second group of students that sat for the exam, so I earned my credential in 2008 and continued to stay involved. Certainly some of the founding members of the council, Molly Green, Marky Pitts, MJ Shepard, all of them I met through Primer workshops or Primer meetings, at the Primer meetings, and got involved with them. They, encouraged me, to continue to pursue IACUC administration. So they kept me involved in it, which was really nice on their part to take me sort of under their wing. And that's then how I got more involved in the council itself. And now I'm the chair of the council. It's a variety of volunteers, all of us who feel it's important to recognize IACUC administrators, and we come from all walks of life. We have academics, we have pharmaceutical companies, VA. So they're all from different parts of life. We all run our programs differently, which again is one of the things that makes IACUC administration a little bit difficult to even talk about, because the regulations and the guidance out there all have these very broad, like you must document what happens at a meeting of your IACUC. But other than a few things that have to be recorded, the rest of it, and you have to document so that someone else can read them and know what kind of discussion happened. So does that mean it has to be word for word? Does it have to be? So there's this whole large variety of ways that you can do things. And so that's one of the interesting things when council gets together, is that all of us on council have our own way of doing things at our own home institution. So trying to pull that all together can sometimes be a little bit challenging, but they all work very hard. We all work very hard at it. Primer does a great job of hosting the council sessions and helping us out. They provide the support that we need to try and, make it work. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. One of the things right now that we're having the most, that we're wrestling with the most is actually some of the eligibility. We really want this credential to be for those administrators doing this type of work at the institutional level on a daily, substantial basis. And it's hard to sometimes get that across to individuals that are involved with IACUCs sort of as a adjunct to their full-time job. So, for instance, investigators. Do they deal with IACUCs? Absolutely. They have to turn in the protocols. They have to answer the responses if the IACUC wants more information. They may have to have their lab inspected if they're doing work with the animals actually in their laboratory instead of in a central facility. So they actually do deal with an IACUC, but that doesn't make them IACUC administrators. But many times we'll get people who will say, well, I'd like to sit for this exam. And so, that's something that, and because we are still a young credentialing program, we are struggling a bit with making sure that we've got our eligibility criteria defined enough, making sure that we're as encouraging as we can be to those individuals who are applying but may not quite meet the eligibility requirement without discouraging them. So that's difficult. Probably one of the most interesting research projects that I ever worked on, and it's been, this was back in the 1980s, was actually artificial hearts. And I actually did some work with artificial hearts in calves. And that was not only a challenging surgical procedure, but just a very interesting technological advance, looking at artificial hearts and, whether or not they're doable. And I think for the most part, they were doable, but certainly they weren't going to give the donor much flexibility in life. I think that's probably why artificial hearts maybe haven't become what everybody had thought they might be back in the 1980s. I think everybody thought that might be a way to help all those individuals out there that needed transplants and couldn't get them, that they would be able to have this artificial heart and they could use that instead. But you really are tethered to a machine, and maybe that'll change. I mean, certainly technology has come a long way. I can remember, I think now about the difference between giving presentations when I was in research, back in the 1980s, and doing a presentation at Primer or even at any other scientific organization. You have people that are working on their PowerPoints, the day before the presentation or on the plane on the way. Years ago, you had to put those presentations together, have a photographer come in and take a slide of them, then take it to the photo place to have the slide developed. You had to have all that done ahead of time. So I think there's been a lot of changes in technology, and certainly down the road, who knows? So that was probably one of my most interesting research projects that I worked on. My research was mostly basic science. So what it has done is maybe advance the scientific knowledge, but I don't think the normal individual realizes that necessarily, because it doesn't necessarily it didn't directly result in a new drug or a cure for a disease. But what it does is it gives you a little bit more idea of how that organ works, so that then somebody else who has the expertise in, say, the pharmacology of it can then make a drug that will work along those pathways. There's too many times where individuals think that investigators want to work with the animals as their first line, and that's so not true. There are so many other things that they do before they work with the animals. They do a lot of in vitro work. They do a lot of benchtop studies to advance their hypothesis as far as they can until they need to be able to pull in that whole animal model. And it's easy, I think, to understand if you think about the difference between you and I just sitting here, how different we are, our skin coloration, our heights, our weights, our ages, all the other things that go into what make us different. We are definitely not twins. And so to be able to translate that into medicine is to understand that it is so different. And that's why a computer is never going to work, because a computer can only emulate one portion of that and not all of the integrated parts of who we are. Research ethics can't stand by itself any more than research administration can, any more than research itself can. They all have to work together. And so I think trying to remember that, to be collaborative, and to treat each of those other groups as peers would be what I would consider most important. I guess what I would wish for most would be to somehow enhance the collaboration. I do think that sometimes there is too much, what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of like an isolation, where this researcher has his work and he wants to protect it as his versus necessarily bringing in someone else and sharing it so much. I think that's getting better, but I'd like to see that probably strengthened, where the collaboration was a little bit broader and a little bit easier to do, that everybody wasn't always so concerned about getting the credit for themselves as much as getting the credit for the advancement that it might engender. So I think that's probably one area that I'd look at. I understand it. I mean, I think it's human nature to always look out for yourself first. So that's what makes it hard. It's getting better.